Welcome to the How HR Leaders Change the World podcast. I'm your host, Cecilia Crossley, and each week we explore how the work of HR leaders is also creating positive social change, contributing to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Goals which the world's companies are increasingly understanding the urgency of achieving and investing in the action required. If you'd like clear, actionable ideas for how you can use the power of your role to affect change in your company, you're in the right place. Following a corporate upbringing, I founded the social enterprise From Babies with Love. We provide services to HR leaders, and through this work, I realised that HR professionals and social entrepreneurs are working in the same areas, albeit in different ways. So we created this podcast to share knowledge on steps we can take through the work of HR. In my opinion, if you're an HR professional, you are also a change maker. And this podcast will provide you with examples of how. By sharing the successes of some of the world's most inspiring HR leaders, you can frame your work in the context of positive change, implement brilliant ideas, and feel absolutely wonderful about doing so. A very warm welcome to Salima Bhimani, who is Chief Strategist and Director of Equity, Diversity and Inclusion at Other Bets. And Other Bets is all of the parts of Alphabet, with the exception of Google. So if you haven't heard of Alphabet as the parent company of Google before, let me tell you, because I've been doing a little bit of research in preparation for this episode, and I totally got lost down a rabbit hole, finding out all the interesting things that Alphabet does, from automatic driving technology to drone delivery to work in healthcare. And the one that surprised me, Salima, I must admit to you that I didn't know that Alphabet owns Fitbit. And I think a lot of our listeners will know it's a household name brand really now, isn't it, Fitbit? So I think, those are just some of the examples I've just listed there. But Salima, please may I ask you to briefly introduce yourself?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you, Cecilia, for having me. It's an honor to be in conversation with you and to be part of the broader conversation that you are definitely, bringing to HR leaders and to HR around the world. I really appreciate it. So as you introduced, my name is Salima Bhimani, and I grew up in Canada, which is, people are always surprised about that because I live in the United States with my job and my family now. I grew up in Canada, and growing up in Canada, I think people assume that, you come from a multicultural society and sort of it's more inclusive than the United States. But, I can tell you that early on in life, I learned pretty quickly what it meant to be a woman of color living in Canada, and became very attuned to sort of the differences of experience that people of color and women and other underrepresented groups have on a day-to-day and had on a day-to-day. So that really set the tone, I think, for my life, quite frankly, and set me down a career and educational path. So I've been working in the space of equity, inclusion, and diversity for the last 24 years across government, nonprofit, academia, and for-profit. And all of my degrees are also in this space. I have a PhD that looks at how we address social exclusion at the intersection of communities and institutions. So it's kind of the thing that I've been both living as a woman of color, but also doing as a woman of color professionally and academically. So I feel very, very grateful. And I always say, if you think of 24 years back trying to do this work, it's a very different environment than now. We're working in a world where, like you said, when you and I were talking earlier, that people are more attuned to language and people are becoming more aware that addressing equity, inclusion, and diversity is not something that is a side note, right? But we need to really be thinking about this with more seriousness and integrating it into our organizations and what we're trying to achieve in the world.
Thank you, Salima. And I am really looking forward to, not only in the context of the culture we're in today, as you described, but learning from you, given that level of detailed academic study and, your expertise from an academic perspective that you have in the discipline, and how you're applying that to the transformational work you're doing at Alphabet and the other organisations you've worked in. It's going to be fascinating for our listeners to learn from you, and me too. So thank you again for joining us. And may I ask our first question? which is, as an HR leader whose influence creates social change, what do you feel has been your most impactful action to date?
I don't think of myself as an HR leader, which is funny, I think, given the fact that oftentimes people think of equity, inclusion, and diversity as living in HR. But the reason why I say don't think of myself that way is because I really see equity, inclusion, and diversity as being a business challenge to solve and an organizational challenge to solve, which is not necessarily only about whether HR is actually going to lead in this way or whether HR is in fact going to address the problem. It is really an organizational and business-wide challenge. And so for me, it's really important actually to take EID outside of HR and to start thinking about it as an organizational design question and an organizational outcome question as much as it is a business outcome question. And so, I can describe myself and what I do in a million different ways. But at the end of the day, what I want to try to do is get the business and the organization to have more equitable outcomes. And what I mean by that is that we want to ensure that not only are we hiring underrepresented folks within our organization, but we have a view for what is the outcome, long-term outcome that we want to achieve in terms of equity, inclusion, and representation. And what do we need to do in order to get there? Both from a culture perspective, from a processes perspective, from a perspective of retention and progression, but also from the perspective of as a business, like if you are building a technology, what is the impact of your technology on underrepresented communities? Like, are they part of the thinking when you're building that technology? So for me, EID really spans across an organization and a business. And so that in some ways is why I don't see myself as an HR professional. Well, at the same time, HR has a fundamental role to play in this work. And there's no denying that. I just think that historically we have, I think, lost ground by thinking that this is an HR issue, which a lot of people have interpreted as compliance, that the thing that we're trying to solve for is compliance. Or that, HR is because HR tends to be the organizational function that really drives people experience on a day-to-day, that this is just about people. Well, yeah, but there are things in the system that actually influence and affect people. And that is not just owned by HR, that is owned and by many people and across the organization.
Yeah, I love that perspective that you've just shared, Salima. It was absolutely one of the reasons I was really excited to have you on the podcast to share that viewpoint. Because I think in many organisations that I speak to, equity, inclusion and diversity is held by the HR function, but there is that broadening. And I've heard people talk about the relationship with their marketing function and product design function, as you were talking about there, and how ED&I is reflected in their customers, not just their employees, but all, and all stakeholders, as you were saying. And so may I ask, when you are creating that transformation at work and sharing the enthusiasm for this topic across people of all different functions and leaders of all divisions, what is your approach to achieving that others might learn from you and do in their work too?
Yeah. So one of the things that I talk a lot about is that, we really need to reorient how we think about equity, inclusion, and diversity. So, historically, if you look at it, whether it lived in HR or not, and particularly in tech, I'll talk about tech specifically, in general, what we saw historically is really an approach to quote unquote diversity and inclusion that really focused on let's increase representation and let's make people feel good when they get here. Right. And I don't want to, there are probably people who are doing more than that. So I don't want to dismiss all the other work that was happening. But in general, that was kind of the approach. The notion of equity is something that was new, not for me, because I think given the span of sort of areas that I've worked in, equity has always been part and parcel of those conversations around EID and in my own approach. But definitely in tech, equity is a newer concept. And what we're trying to address with equity is really about whether we have systems and processes, a culture where some people are actually having an unfair outcome or an unjust outcome because of their social identity. So a very concrete example of that could be, we hire, let's say, Black women into our organization, but when it comes to leveling them, we notice that actually we're leveling them at a lower place than we are, people who are non-Black. Assuming that you level in your organization, not everybody does that. We definitely do that in tech. We level people when they come in. And so are we leveling people or are we leveling roles, right? That's a very concrete example of, hey, now let's look at the data around how we've leveled people, and let's see if there's a discrepancy. Do we see more Black women that are leveled at a lower level? Do we see more white men that are, leveled at a higher level? That kind of inquiry starts to get us at who is having a fair outcome and who's not having a fair outcome. That is a very different sort of mindset than saying something like, hey, we think we have a problem, like women are not succeeding. Let's set up a mentorship program. But that's not really addressing the problem. The problem may not be mentorship. The problem might be how we're actually evaluating and assessing people, right? So it's really about distilling what the problem is. And so for me, equity is absolutely central. And what I say is that when we have that point of view, then we can start to think about systemic and structural change. And this is how I approach EID. I'm not interested in surface level change. I think surface level things are important. But what I'm interested in literally changing how we behave, what we put into the system, how that system then has a particular kind of output, right? And by system, again, I mean processes, systems, the organizational design, literally, of how we think about our organizations, and ultimately, the effect that our business is having on the world. So for me, like the equity piece is central, and having a more systemic change perspective is central. And I think that people, at least in my experience at Alphabet, when I came to Alphabet in 2017, that is something that was very clear about, that with the bets, because they are more nascent they were more nascent organizations, they really had an opportunity to integrate EID into their DNA right from the get-go, right? So rather than turning a ship that's 20 years old or 30 years old, which is much harder, by the way, not impossible, but much, much harder, how do we integrate it from the get-go into everything about how we operate and, again, the impact that we're having in the world? And that, to be honest with you, is much harder, Cecilia. Like, it is not easy. It's much easier to set up an ERG, and it's much easier to say, hey, let's have a mentorship program. And it's much easier to say, let's go to, historically Black colleges and universities to go and go and find talent. Much harder to say, let's really look at what is inhibiting us from getting to certain outcomes. Do we even understand the outcomes that we want to get to? Right. And for me, that kind of work is fundamental, and that has to start with leadership. And so that's something that I've done across the bets, is really work at the leadership level to get them aligned on concepts, language. What is their why for EID? Where is the long-term change that they want to make? Why do they want to make it? And what kind of investment are they going to have to put in order to make that real? That should not be the job of HR. That should not be the job of underrepresented folks. That is the job of leadership, and that kind of switch in where we're putting time and effort and energy, I think has long-term impact. And I think it's a very different kind of orientation than, like I said, that we've seen historically.
Amazing, Salima. It's really inspiring to hear you describe that approach. And just for my layperson's understanding, when you were giving the example of levelling colleagues, do you mean the pay bands that they're ascribed to when they start?
Yeah. The leveling may not be a good example for the global audience here, but in tech, historically there's been an approach where when somebody gets hired into a role, they have levels, right? So there's like level 3, level 4, level 5, and that does correspond to pay bands. But it also corresponds to kind of how you are organizationally situated in the context of a org. Every org might be different in terms of how they level, but usually leveling should correspond to, hey, here is the role expectation, the role scope, etc. But what we find is that there is, again, broadly speaking in tech, evidence that, we have not leveled people equitably. And in fact, there has been bias and unfairness in how we have actually leveled people.
Great, thank you. It may well be that all the HR experts listening know exactly what you meant, but I didn't. So I just thought, just in case someone else wasn't sure, I'll ask the question. And you talked about the broader industry for tech, which is, of course, given the pace of change and innovation, fascinating to think about. And in the work that you're doing, I'd love to ask you, perhaps about your dreams and your visions for what could be in the industry. And for anybody leading diversity, equity and inclusion, including those business leaders and including many people in HR, what do you see as the most exciting opportunity to change the world?
I mean, I think that you have to have a different view of the world to change it. And I think that if as a leader, your view of the world is to retain the status quo, well, then you're not really going to change the world. Right. So as an example, if the status quo, I'm just making this up, but the status quo is that it is more natural to have male leaders as CEOs, and you, whether you explicitly believe that or implicitly believe that, but you keep making choices and decisions that perpetuate that version of the world, you're not really changing the world, right? I think you have to have a view for why that version of the world is not necessarily working. Like, what are we missing by having that view of the world? What are we missing by having a mental model that informs our decision making that gets us to a point where we continue to hire male CEOs, right? As opposed to giving women and other underrepresented folks, Black folks, brown folks, the opportunity to actually be in those roles, because, by the way, they have the expertise and they just face barriers, right? So you literally have to have a different view of the world. You have to want to have a different world, right? And I think the work that I do with leaders is getting them to confront that. What is your mental model of the world? How do you think the world works? Why do you think it works that way? If it was to work differently, what would it look like? Who would therefore be included? Who would therefore be excluded? And that kind of self-inquiry is very, very important for leaders to then arrive at, right, so this worldview that I have, or the world that I've been contributing to, right, that's retained the status quo, is actually leaving out entire groups of people, is actually having an adverse impact on all these people, right? So what am I going to do about that? I'm going to make sure that my leadership team, as an example, has women on it, has Black folks on it, has LGBTQ folks on it, has people with disabilities on it, because that is ultimately going to change even the product that we're building, because it's going to have points of view that, by the way, we were missing, right? That's a different worldview than retaining the status quo. So I think that's a really important starting point.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And when you are working with the leaders at the group companies, all the different group companies of Alphabet, do you feel optimistic about their response to these really fundamental questions that you ask them?
Yes, I do. I feel like there's so much receptivity and curiosity. And, like the entirety of my career, I have not met a leader who has not been afraid, right? Or who's not been worried about, am I going to say the wrong thing? But what if I actually believe this thing because I just grew up in that way? Like, I grew up not talking to Black people. I grew up not thinking about, my advantage as a white man. I grew up not thinking of, because I didn't have to, right? I had sort of, the world was designed in such a way where I could walk through it and not have to think about these things. So I think that underlying a lot of this is a sense of fear, and that's real for people because they don't want to get things wrong. And as leaders, they're leading companies, they're leading organizations. And, I think a lot of them, all the leaders that I work with are so good intentioned and actually really want to learn in this space. And I think that is so encouraging to me. But are also being willing to be vulnerable and say, hey, like, I don't know it all, right? Like, I need to be on a journey. And so, hey, Salima, let's partner to make this happen. So I'm very encouraged by that. And, and the level of investment, because learning and building your capability in equity, inclusion, and diversity means personal and professional investment. And it's not a training. I keep telling people, like, training is not going to change people. What is going to change people is a consistent investment in thinking about this and building a practice around being equitable and inclusive and increasing representation. It is a practice. And every day we have to practice that muscle and build it. And so I think for me, I'm very encouraged by the leaders that I work with. And, again, it's long-term, change is long-term. I wish it wasn't, quite frankly. It's because some days it's exhausting to think how long it is. But also I'm hopeful that, we're going to over time get somewhere. But I think the last thing I'll say about this, the thing that leaders have to confront, this is just generally speaking, leaders have to confront in themselves. And we saw this with like Black Lives Matter over the last, year and a half with the murder of George Floyd, where, a lot of organizations, a lot of companies across the world got really activated and really interested in starting to think about racial inequity, racial injustice. But we also noticed that activation didn't really live on, right? It kind of, people got excited and they're like, we got to do this, and then kind of fizzled out. And if you talk to a lot of equity, inclusion, and diversity leaders, what they'll tell you is that they got excited because like, oh, finally we can have these real conversations. And then they notice that, but the investment is not there. Oh, okay. The leader says that they're interested, but they're not necessarily willing to, ensure that their organization is focused on this in the way that it should be. So I think what it also tells me is that leaders getting activated is amazing, but then they have to be curious and willing to then take the steps after that. And even if they don't know what those steps are, I think working with their EI&D leaders, working with external consultants, whoever it is, to help them figure it out is fundamentally important, because this is a road. I mean, if everybody knew how to do it, we'd be living in a different world. Let's be honest, Cecilia, we really would be. But people don't know. So they have to be willing to say, well, what is the work then? If I don't know what the work is, what is it? And how am I going to actually invest myself and my organization in doing that work? And it's not easy. I can tell you that it's not. But with commitment and perseverance, I think, again, and thinking long term, so you don't have to feel like you have to solve it yesterday, because that in and of itself leads to sometimes bad practices, I think opens up the door for something else.
How HR Leaders Change the World is brought to you by From Babies with Love, and this episode is sponsored by our very own parental leave gift service. We help solve the challenge of connecting with colleagues across parental leave and in returning to work, contributing to talent retention and so too gender balance strategy. From Babies with Love donates 100% of its profits to orphaned and abandoned children. Your beautiful, sustainably sourced From Babies with Love gifts come with the story of how your company is also helping a less fortunate child, creating meaningful engagement. We transform spend that so often already takes place on flowers or products that don't have the Sustainable Development Goals at their heart. We transform that spend to become a consistent, inclusive and strategic part of your working parents programme. Ask us to tell you more at frombabieswithlove.org. Make an impact at a defining moment. Thank you, Salima. And all the way through what you're saying, I couldn't help but think about the parallels to social entrepreneurship. And just with every one of these episodes I do, I just think more and more that the work of people leaders, HR leaders, equity, inclusion, diversity leaders, anybody working in this space, and social entrepreneurs is so similar, because, all social entrepreneurs have a different view of the world, an opinion on how it can be better, and that is motivating the social enterprise that they're working in and the work they're doing, and don't necessarily have all the answers to how to solve, major global issue. Sustainable Development Goal number, pick 1 to 17, all massive, all hard, all really long, multi-year, multi-decade challenges to solve and work on. But people are curious, and the activation you described is happening more and more, I think, and at a faster rate, and makes me optimistic too.
Yeah. I also, just one more thing, sorry to just add to what you just said. I mean, I think the other thing, and this might feel a little bit big to people, but I think it's important, is to think about sometimes organizations or businesses have massive impact on something, right? And sometimes they have smaller impacts on something. But I think the question to ask is, what is the contribution that you're making to things that are actually unjust out there currently? So as an example, something that I've talked to some of the different bets about is, if you are in, like, for example, in the VC, we have, VCs, GV, CapG, that think about, they're investing in companies, they're investing in industries, they're investing in founders. And, one of the questions to ask is, are you actually, by the investments that you're making, how are you helping address wealth inequity, as an example? And we know that there's wealth inequity across race and gender, right? So even though you can't necessarily fully solve wealth inequity, right, because there's a lot of people who need to be involved in that, how is what you're doing either contributing to that inequity or helping at least provide some seeds to addressing it? Right. And then work backwards from there and say, okay, so what do we need to do? What are the choices we need to make in order to contribute to a different outcome? And that, again, might feel big to people, but it's less about I'm trying to completely solve wealth inequity and more about, am I actually perpetuating it? Am I helping address it in the small ways or big ways that we can? How are the choices we're making as a business actually going to help shape a different world over time. And that, I think, again, is helpful to illuminate, because sometimes people don't even know, right? How is my business actually contributing to this thing that seems way out there, right? But it's actually not way out there. Each of us, each business company is actually part of a conglomerate of an ecosystem, right? Of reproducing certain kinds of injustices or contributing to certain kinds of injustices. So we have to roll ourselves back from that and just ask the question, just even asking the question of like, what are we contributing to by these choices and decisions that we're making?
Yeah, brilliant. And you being with us today is absolutely a seed that I hope ending up all over the world and being planted in people's minds and hearts too. So thank you very much for adding that. And to move on to our next question, Salima, is just to ask, well, I know you have a particular area of passion in social and environmental injustice, of course, given what you've already shared today. And it's really just to ask if there's anything else you would like to share about how in your career you are able to contribute to creating change in relation to, your personal passion. If there's any examples of success that others might like to replicate that you'd like to share with us today.
Yeah, I think each of us in our own way, like depending on how we identify in the world, right? Like, or how people identify us, because it's not just us identifying. But oftentimes, people have assumptions about who we are and who we aren't based on our gender or our race or our sexuality or our ability, etc. So, one of the things that I have spent a lot of time doing is thinking about my own advantages. And what kind of social capital I have gained in the world. I'm a South Asian, I identify as a South Asian woman. I have definitely faced throughout my life quite a bit of racism and quite a bit of sexism, in the world, generally speaking, in my career in academia, etc. But I also know that I have particular kinds of privileges and advantages that other people may not, right? Because, for example, how I get read or interpreted in like the corporate world, especially when people impose kind of like sort of this model minority on me because I'm Asian, right? They assume some things about me, right? What they assume about me is that I'm going to succeed. At least getting through the door, right? Because maybe I'm smart and maybe I'm educated and maybe I'm a hard worker. There's all these sort of myths around being a model minority, right? That people assume. And so maybe I have an easier time getting through the door. But then guess what? As I try to like move up in the organization, I might hit barriers to being in management. We see this for Asian women that when they actually try to get into management position, they hit what they call the bamboo ceiling. Right. And so, me becoming aware of, I actually do have relative advantage compared to, let's say, my Black and Latinx sisters or my Indigenous sisters, right? Who are going to face a whole other set of challenges. So what can I do to use my social capital in service of them? How do I use the privileges and advantages that I have so that I actually can be in service of removing injustice for them? And in the process, I remove injustice for myself. And it might seem abstract, but it's not. It's actually about recognizing, where do you have power? If you're an underrepresented person, like you're a woman in the industry and sort of corporate, or you're a person of color, or you're a person who has a disability, or an LGBTQ person, identifying person, where do you have advantages? Where do you have power to actually make change? And where are you actually going to come up against the system, right? Because the system is going to have an effect on you, not necessarily in the positive sense. So that distilling that for myself has been really, really important. So I can figure out, like, how do I be part of the change, but also at the same time recognize the ways in which I'm also affected by the very things that I'm trying to change, right, in the world. So, and I think if we can do that, then we can figure out, how do we be in solidarity with each other? If we can do that, then we can say, okay, how do I not re-perpetuate sort of a system of inequity and exclusion or bias, right? Like, what role can I play in this? How much power do I have to actually play a role? And how do I be part of creating a different world, as you asked earlier, as opposed to kind of just benefiting from the system and not really asking the question, yeah, I've benefited, but at whose expense? And am I now then using the benefits to actually do something different? So that has really helped me. And by the way, I'm still practicing that every single day, right? It's not something that you get right off the bat. I practice it every single day. And in some ways, it's why I think when I came to Alphabet and all the work that I've done historically, one of the things that I've centered is racial equity, right? Because it often is the thing that people are most uncomfortable talking about. And it's often the thing that people most want to ignore or kind of say, hey, I don't see race. But just because you don't see it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And if you don't see it, ask yourself the question of why you don't see it, right? So I feel like so much of my social capital and advantage is in actually continuing to raise that, even as I face racism myself. But I know that me raising it might actually get somewhere different than somebody else raising it. So I'm always trying to figure out, how do I use my social capital to make change? And how do other people use their social capital to make change? And whether you're a white woman or a brown woman or a Black woman or Indigenous woman, we all have a role to play. It may not be the same because we have different levels of advantage, historically speaking, but we all have a role to play. And it's up to us to actually use that social capital to make that change. But let me just say, having said all of that, it is not the responsibility, I want to be clear about this, it is not the responsibility of underrepresented groups to change social inequity. It is the we are part of that, but it is fundamentally the huge responsibility lies on overrepresented folks or folks who have been historically dominant. If they don't change, nothing changes, right? So we do our part, but then people who historically who have not done their part need to also do their part. Otherwise, we're not getting very far. And that shift in the burden of change shift is really, really important.
And when you are running the processes that you do with senior management, is reflecting on their social capital part of the conversations that you have and facilitating them to start the practice and form a new habit in their own reflection?
Yeah, it is completely. Like I'll give you a very concrete example. And you would think that this is obvious, but it's not necessarily obvious to people. We know that managers have an outsized impact on the experience that employees have. They say, people leave managers, not companies, right? So on a day-to-day, managers are actually influencing not only the experience that you're having, but the outcome that you're having, right? So for example, if you're a manager and you have not aligned on your role expectations, this is very, very concrete. If you have not aligned on role expectations, if you're walking around trying to do your job and you have no idea what your manager expects from you, that's a problem, right? How are you going to succeed? You have no idea about what it means to succeed in your role. And we actually see this happen across the board to, women, people of color, others, and in general, but definitely for those folks. So, part of this is helping managers realize that you actually have an outsized effect. And even if you just started asking the question as a manager, in the decisions that I'm making, am I actually excluding women? Am I excluding people of color? Am I excluding somebody who has a disability? And the decision could be something simple as who speaks in team meetings. It could be something simple as, which is not so simple sometimes, who's getting the most opportunities to actually be visible in the organization, right? So just stepping back and saying, hey, who am I excluding in these decisions? Am I excluding someone in these decisions? And what I find sometimes with leaders, which I find funny and ironic, is that they'll say something like, I have a view for how I'm inclusive, but I didn't realize I didn't have a view for how I could be exclusionary. So they haven't made the connection, right? They're like, everybody has good intention and wants to say, hey, I want to be more inclusive. But in order to get there, you actually have to look at how you actually might be exclusionary, right? In your choices and your decisions and your interactions. And that I find is an aha moment for a lot of managers and leaders where they're like, oh, right. I actually need to be asking a different question. I need to be asking, am I leaving anybody out? Do I notice any patterns in, who's getting promoted and who's not getting promoted? Right? Do I notice any patterns in who's getting feedback and who's not getting feedback? Right? These are very practical, real life things, but I find that just getting managers to ask different questions or just getting leaders to ask different questions opens them up to say, right, I actually haven't been looking at whether in fact my practices are not good for everyone, or maybe they are, right? But I don't know until I actually look at it.
There's so much more I want to ask you, but I'm going to move on for the sake of time. But question 4 it's where we hone in on equity and inclusion. And of course, we've been talking about that this whole time. And it's about how, you best use the social capital you have and the impact you have in your role to deliver the commercial goals of Alphabet. But just to add a practical element to everything we've been talking about so far, for somebody listening and feeling inspired by you, and thinking, well, where do I start if I would like to design system change in my company? I don't have time to do a PhD. So how can I learn from Salima? And what would you advise? It's just the key framework that you would implement if you were starting from scratch somewhere new.
I think we have to definitely do a landscape analysis as a starting point of any organization. And what I mean by that is understanding, again, I use this language of like what enables equity, inclusion, and diversity in our organization and what inhibits equity, inclusion, and diversity in our organization. And that is a process that you have to go through, right? I mean, part of it is that the organization has to be willing to look at itself, right? That in and of itself. So if you are an HR leader, or if you're an EI&D leader, or if you're none of those, but you're a leader who cares about this, I think the big starting point is asking the organization of whether it's willing to look at itself. And that takes influence. It takes having the hard conversations with leadership and saying, hey, like, we're interested in doing this work, but we first need to understand like where we are. We need to have a baseline. We need to have a starting point, right? And then from there, what I would do is engage in that landscape analysis, and that can be at multiple levels. And I think of it as like sort of at the experiential level. So what is the experience that, underrepresented groups are having in your organization? Are they feeling like they are valued and supported by their managers? Are they feeling like they're getting pay equity? Are they feeling like, they belong? Are they feeling like, when they are in team meetings, they are heard and they are seen? So really it's about at the experiential level. And then you want to look at it at the process level. Are there things in our processes that are actually getting in the way for us to be equitable? So as an example, a concrete example, when we are hiring, do we even have data on our pass-through rates? Right. So at the screening level, do we understand who's actually making it past screening? At the second interview level, do we know who's making it past second interview? That's again very concrete, and there's different ways you can do that. So that's kind of at the system level, right? Another system level example could be, hey, in our performance evaluations, are we seeing any discrepancies in the way women are being evaluated versus the way men are being evaluated? When we give ratings, do we see any discrepancies in ratings? So we want to look at those processes in our organizations to see, are we again getting to fair outcomes or unfair outcomes? And by fair outcomes, I just mean at the bare minimum that there's no disparity, right, across gender, race, class, etc. And then you want to look at it at what I call like kind of the accountability level. And the accountability level is really the question of, where are my leaders, right? What do they care about when it comes to EI&D? What don't they care about? What are they interested in, right? Because some people are just not interested in doing a whole lot, right? And so really evaluating, where is the leadership at? We have to ask that question. And what do they care about? What don't they care about? Where is their mind when it comes to EI&D? Where isn't it? Where are the gaps in their knowledge and skills, and assessing that? So again, there's more to this than that, but at the very least, it's sort of, these are the levels at which we want to really make sense of things. And I think if you do have underrepresented folks in your organization, talking to them is fundamental. It is such a huge part of making sense of what's going on in your organization and starting to identify even patterns. Because part of the landscape analysis is you want to know whether there's patterns in your organization that are telling you that, hey, either we're doing really, really well in this, or we actually have a problem that we need to look at. And the last thing I'll say is, for example, with pay and equity analysis, we know that, for example, you might look at your pay equity and find that there's no discrepancy between men and women and how they get paid. Okay, great. But the thing you want to do is you want to dig in further and you want to say, right, but is the way in which women are getting evaluated again in performance, or the way in which people are being leveled in our organization or brought into our organization, whatever our org structure is that actually setting them back? So even if ultimately pay equity says it's not a problem, is actually the problem much more at the beginning than it is at the end, right? So if we bring in women at a certain level or a certain position in the organization, does that mean that they're already set up for a certain kind of pay where they're actually being disadvantaged? Again, we don't know these things, right? But we have to ask the question. So even as we dig in at the sort of surface level, we have to kind of dig in further underneath. This takes time and effort. I'm not suggesting this gets done overnight, but I think doing that kind of deep landscape analysis is definitely the starting point, so that then you can set a strategy and say, right, so what are the first things that we need to tackle so that X, Y, and Z is happening, so that underrepresented folks feel like they are being valued and supported, and you can't tackle it all. right? You have to prioritize that. And in my own practice and what I do with the vets, I have a way of getting at that. Every EID practitioner will have a different way of doing it, but I think that is definitely the starting point. Make sense of what's going on in your organization. Ask the hard questions. Put up the mirror. Build the courage and the vulnerability for people to want to look. And that's going to take influence and conversation. And by the way, after you do the landscape analysis and you bring it to your organization, it's going to take some time for leaders to actually really absorb that, because it's hard. Sometimes it's hard to see your organization and be like, fine, we're doing well in this, but in this area, it's really bad, or it's not that great, or I didn't realize there was a problem, right? And a lot of people have dissonance around that because they want to believe something about their organization, like that it's good, that we're doing well. But I think it takes courage to look at the things that are hard and that don't necessarily match up with that vision of what we think might be true. And so we just need to give people space for that, to learn and grow into that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Salima. That you just covered a huge amount there. So just to really acknowledge that you were just skimming the surface, but it was so helpful to hear you break down like where to start with the landscaping exercise and break that down into the different components of it and the different perspectives within that and things to look at. So thank you very much for sharing that really useful way of doing the work. And our final question, Salima, is our hardest because it's our shortest, and that makes it the hardest, I think. And it's to get really specific so that, with the pressures of a zillion things on a to-do list and all the competing priorities people have, if people could just do one thing, just start somewhere, what is the one thing that you would like to see all people leaders, all EI&D practitioners, all HR professionals do to make a positive change for the world?
Yeah, I think, again, historically, broadly speaking, in HR, let's talk about HR specifically, and the HR function and leaders. I really think that there is an opportunity for HR to invest in their own capability around equity, inclusion, and diversity. And I just have not seen the level of investment that's required in order for that organization to be really capable to drive long-term change. So I think whether you are a CHRO or whether you're a head of, HR, I think really investing in your team's capability. And I'm not, again, talking about doing 5 trainings. I'm talking about long-term investment and really understanding, like, what is it that we affect as an HR org? And why do we need the kind of capability around equity, inclusion, and diversity to actually change the outcomes for people on a day-to-day? And that is so important. And that is a long-term investment. And it's going to take learning things, practicing things, failing at them, and then trying again, right? So, and I know that can be hard with HR because everybody is always like sort of, bringing, the gauntlet comes down on HR, let's be honest. Things go wrong and everybody goes to HR and says, well, you see, it was your fault. You didn't get it right. And that can be a really hard tension to deal with. And I empathize with that. And at the same time, I think HR orgs have to have a more progressive view on their role when it comes to EID and really invest in their capability over the long term and keep practicing that skill. And if that's true, and if you're going to do that, then you actually have to redefine what HR means. Because HR is not just compliance, right? It's really affecting people's lives and it's affecting your org culture. And as people who are affecting org culture in people's lives, you have a increased responsibility to become capable in this space.
Thank you, Salima. It's been such a pleasure to listen to you. I honestly love the viewpoints that you share and the approach that you bring to this work. And, I love that you ask the question, what is your vision of the world? You're just, challenging the status quo and wanting to make the world and everything and everybody in it have a better experience. So I really honestly feel, I wish I could give you a hug through my computer. That's how I feel. And I really appreciate your time. And so thank you again for joining us on How HR Leaders Change the World.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate this conversation and, your openness and willingness to continue to create space for it because it's so important. And I'm hoping we'll continue to be in conversation over the years.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of How HR Leaders Change the World. Thank you for tuning in. If you have a moment to leave a review, a 5-star one please, that would be a huge help to achieving our goal to reach more of your peers, so we can all contribute to further and faster positive change. For your copy of the show notes, head to frombabieswithlove.org, where you can also join the How HR Leaders Change the World mailing list, and make sure you don't miss out on future episodes and bonus materials. And for harnessing the power of your role to create positive social change, I'm sending you a jumping up in the air virtual high five. See you next time on How HR Leaders Change the World.